In this video, we're uncovering timeless wisdom from Aristotle on how to live a fulfilling life. His ideas are more relevant today than ever, and they could completely shift how you think about happiness, purpose, and success. Stick around till the end for life-changing insights you won't want to miss. Number 1. The significance of purpose in all aspects of life. Aristotle had this deeply ingrained belief that purpose, or telos as he called it, wasn't just some lofty ideal reserved for philosophers to ponder, it was the glue that held everything together. He thought that everything in life, from the smallest detail to the grandest goal, is driven by a kind of inner purpose, and if you ignore that, you're missing out on the full experience of living. We've kind of lost touch with that understanding in modern times, haven't we? We often get so caught up in day-to-day distractions that we forget to ask, what's the purpose behind what I'm doing? When Aristotle talked about purpose, he wasn't talking about it like some big, abstract mission statement. He saw it in everything. Each action, each decision, whether big or small, had its own purpose that led to something bigger. He would argue that living a fulfilled life means being in tune with this sense of purpose across all areas of your life, not just career or success. Your relationships, your hobbies, how you spend your free time, it all ties back to a deeper meaning. But how often do we pause to reflect on that? Nowadays, it's easy to get stuck in routines, following the same patterns without really questioning why. Our daily lives often become a string of obligations, appointments, and to-do lists. It's easy to see life as a series of tasks to complete rather than a journey to pursue meaning. That's where Aristotle's wisdom comes in. He'd probably tell us that we've become too focused on the surface, on achieving for the sake of achieving, without connecting it to the bigger picture of why we're doing it. What's the point if we're just going through the motions? The beauty of Aristotle's thinking is that it encourages us to ask ourselves those deeper questions regularly. It's not just about having one grand purpose in life, it's about finding the purpose in all of life's moments. This idea applies not just to what we think of as big decisions, like choosing a career path or setting life goals, but also to the simple, everyday choices. Why do you spend your time the way you do? What's driving you? Is there an underlying reason for the things that fill your days, or are you simply doing them out of habit? Aristotle believed that living with purpose wasn't just about working towards some final goal either. It was about aligning your actions with your values and making sure that everything you do reflects a deeper understanding of what's important to you. That's what brings fulfillment. It's not about hustling through life or constantly chasing success. Instead, it's about living intentionally, fully aware that each step you take is part of a larger, meaningful journey. So, maybe we've forgotten how to look for purpose in the everyday life. But Aristotle reminds us that it's always there, if only we take the time to notice. Living a life of purpose isn't reserved for monumental achievements or grand aspirations. It's about making sure that every choice, every action, even the small ones, reflects who we are and what we truly value. That's the kind of life worth living. Number 2, the belief that true happiness is not found in pleasure alone. Aristotle had a pretty unique take on happiness, one that doesn't really line up with the way many of us think about it today. We live in a world where it seems like happiness is wrapped up in the pursuit of pleasure, whether that's indulging in a tasty meal, going on a vacation, or getting that quick dopamine hit from scrolling through social media. And yeah, those moments feel good. Really good, sometimes. But Aristotle? He believed true happiness, or eudaimonia as he called it, went much deeper than fleeting pleasures. For Aristotle, pleasure wasn't bad, let's not misunderstand him there. It just wasn't the whole picture. He argued that while pleasure is part of a happy life, chasing it alone doesn't lead to that lasting sense of fulfillment we all crave. You might enjoy something in the moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're living a fully happy life. Think of it this way, imagine a bucket with a small hole at the bottom. Pleasure is like pouring water into the bucket, it'll fill up for a while, but then it'll start to drain. You need to keep adding more to maintain that level. That's what happens when we rely only on pleasure. It fades, and you're left wanting more. It's kind of an endless chase. So, what's the alternative, then? Aristotle had this idea that the real key to happiness was living in alignment with virtue. Now, virtue might sound like a heavy word, something reserved for moral philosophers or maybe even outdated. But for Aristotle, it was practical. Being virtuous meant living well, developing good habits, and acting in ways that were consistent with our best selves. It's not about being perfect or saintly, it's more about balance, finding that sweet spot between extremes. He had a concept called the golden mean, which basically means not going overboard with things, but also not depriving yourself. Let's break it down a little more. If you're only after pleasure, you might miss out on some important things. For example, acting selfishly to get what feels good for you in the moment might hurt someone else, and that can ripple back into your own life in negative ways. Or maybe you find yourself in a cycle of overindulgence, where too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. Aristotle believed happiness was found in living in a way that not only benefits you but also enriches the people around you and your community as a whole. It's a long-term investment, rather than a quick fix. He also pointed out that some of the deepest forms of satisfaction come not from what we take in, like pleasure, but from what we give or create. Think about developing skills, building relationships, or contributing to something larger than yourself. These things might not give that instant pleasure high, but they bring a kind of lasting joy that sticks with you. You grow as a person, and that growth is what sustains happiness. In today's world, it's easy to forget this. We're surrounded by messages that encourage instant gratification. Buy this, eat that, experience this, and then you'll be happy. But Aristotle would say that real happiness isn't in those quick hits of pleasure. It's in the long game, where you cultivate virtues, grow in wisdom, and live with purpose. So, sure, enjoy pleasure when it comes, it's part of life. But don't expect it to carry the full weight of your happiness. There's something deeper, more enduring, waiting for you when you live with intention and care. It's not always easy, and sometimes it takes effort, but that's where true happiness is found. Aristotle knew that, and maybe, just maybe, we've forgotten it along the way. Number 3, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. The pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, what a lost art that has become. In Aristotle's time, the idea of learning was deeply intertwined with the joy of discovery itself. There wasn't this constant need to justify it, to attach a useful label to every nugget of wisdom. Today, we often treat learning as a means to an end. It's all about the next certification, the promotion, the problem you need to solve right now. But Aristotle? He saw knowledge as something more. Something deeper. He believed in learning simply for the sheer pleasure of it, for the way it expands your mind, opens up new worlds, and satisfies your innate curiosity. That's the thing, curiosity was at the heart of it all. Aristotle understood that the desire to know, to understand, was a natural part of being human. It's like we're wired to be curious. But somewhere along the way, we lost that spark. We became so obsessed with the utility of knowledge that we forgot how to learn just for the joy of it. Nowadays, people tend to approach learning like it's a checklist. We gather information when it's necessary, and we stop once we have enough. Everything becomes a transaction. What will I get out of this? Instead of an experience. But back in Aristotle's day, learning was more like an adventure. You didn't just pursue knowledge to check a box. You pursued it because it made you more alive, more connected to the world around you. It was less about answers and more about the questions. There's something beautifully liberating about that. Imagine just diving into a subject because you're fascinated by it, not because it will get you somewhere. It's the difference between living life by the map and exploring life without one. Aristotle saw knowledge as a kind of nourishment for the soul. You didn't need to justify it. It wasn't about practicality, at least not in the short term. In the long run, maybe, sure, knowledge might come in handy. But the journey, the process of learning itself, was enough of a reward. That's a mindset we've largely lost. It's not that we don't value education today, we do. But we've added all these layers of expectation on top of it. Everything needs to be tied to achievement, to productivity, to success. The joy of learning for learning's sake? It's been overshadowed by the pressure to turn that learning into something useful. And that's a shame, because when we allow ourselves to be curious without any expectations, that's when the magic happens. You follow the thread of your curiosity wherever it leads you. No pressure, no deadlines. Just pure, unfiltered exploration. When was the last time you did that? Just let yourself get lost in learning without worrying about whether it would pay off? That's the kind of thing Aristotle cherished. In his world, knowledge wasn't something to be hurried. It wasn't a stepping stone. It was a way of life. So maybe it's time to recapture that, ditch the constant need for usefulness and rediscover the simple joy of learning. Because sometimes, knowing for the sake of knowing is enough. More than enough, actually, it's everything. Number 4, the importance of moderation in pleasures, including intellectual ones. Aristotle had this remarkable idea about pleasure, whether it's physical, emotional, or intellectual. He didn't say pleasures were bad, far from it. In fact, he recognized that pleasure is a natural part of life, something we all seek and enjoy. But, as with so many things, he believed in balance. He taught that while pleasure is important, indulging too much in it, even intellectual pleasures, can lead us off track. He was all about moderation, finding that sweet spot where we enjoy life but don't lose ourselves in the pursuit of pleasure. Let's talk about intellectual pleasures for a moment. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that feeding the mind is inherently good, right? If it's something like learning, reading, or exploring new ideas, that can't be a bad thing, can it? But Aristotle would caution us here. Even too much of what seems like a noble pleasure, like the satisfaction we get from deep thinking or learning new things, can become imbalanced. He saw that there's a danger in becoming consumed by intellectual pursuits, just as there's a danger in overindulging in more obvious pleasures like food or drink. It's all too easy to tip the scale from a healthy curiosity to an obsession that leaves us disconnected from the rest of life. What Aristotle really emphasized was the idea of moderation. Not just for the obvious pleasures we typically associate with indulgence, but for everything. It's like he was warning us against getting carried away, even with things that seem good on the surface. Pleasure, in any form, needs to be balanced with other parts of life to make sure we're not overextending ourselves in one direction and neglecting everything else. This brings us to the concept of the golden mean. It's a simple but powerful idea: the best life is lived in balance. In Aristotle's view, moderation wasn't about denying pleasure or avoiding it altogether, it was about enjoying it in the right amounts. You don't need to give up pleasure to live well, but you do need to know when enough is enough. He would argue that overindulgence in any pleasure, no matter how harmless it might seem at first, eventually leads to imbalance. When we let one aspect of life take over, other important things start to slip away. This doesn't mean Aristotle was anti-pleasure. Quite the opposite, actually. He was very much in favor of finding joy in life. But he'd remind us that the best life isn't one where we chase pleasure at every turn, it's one where we enjoy pleasure as part of a balanced, thoughtful life. For Aristotle, moderation isn't just a rule to follow, it's a way to ensure we get the most out of life. When we live in balance, we appreciate things more. We experience pleasures deeply, but we don't become ruled by them. At the end of the day, Aristotle knew that moderation helps us avoid extremes, whether it's intellectual overindulgence or simply overdoing any form of pleasure. By living with this balance in mind, we stay more grounded and connected to the bigger picture. It's about savoring the pleasures we encounter, while not letting them take the reins. A life with moderation is, in Aristotle's view, one that's more fulfilling, more in tune with who we are, and more meaningful in the long run. Number 5. The role of emotions in ethical decision-making. Aristotle had some pretty interesting things to say about emotions, especially when it comes to making decisions. Now, today, emotions can sometimes get a bad rap. We're often told to think logically or not let feelings cloud our judgment. And sure, there's some truth in that. But for Aristotle, emotions weren't just something to be tamed or pushed aside. They actually had a role, a big one, in fact, in how we navigate ethical decisions. So, how does that work? Well, first off, Aristotle wasn't about throwing emotions out the window. He believed they could guide us in the right direction, as long as we didn't let them take the wheel entirely. He saw emotions as part of what makes us human, and in many ways, they can help us connect to what's right or wrong. But here's the catch: they need to be balanced with reason. Let's take a deeper dive into that idea. Aristotle had this concept of the golden mean, where the key to a virtuous life was finding the middle ground between extremes. The same applies to emotions. If you let emotions totally control your decision-making, it can lead to impulsive or reckless choices. But if you try to suppress them entirely, you can miss out on important insights that emotions offer. It's not about one or the other, it's about a kind of partnership between your heart and your head. Think of it this way: emotions can be like a compass, pointing us in certain directions, but reason is the map. Together, they help us make ethical decisions that feel right and make sense. If we ignore our emotions, we might end up following the map, sure, but we could lose touch with what truly matters to us. On the flip side, if we follow the compass without the map, we might be passionate but lost. Aristotle's sweet spot is somewhere in between, where you let your emotions inform you but not control you. Now, Aristotle also recognized that not all emotions are created equal. Some, like anger or fear, can easily lead us astray if we let them run wild. Others, like compassion or love, can actually motivate us to act ethically. The trick is knowing when to listen to those emotions and when to temper them with a bit of rational thought. It's not easy, and Aristotle knew that too. This isn't something that just happens overnight. It's something you work at, like a skill you develop over time. What Aristotle was really getting at is that emotions aren't these irrational forces that we should always keep at bay. They're a part of who we are, and when we cultivate them properly, they can lead us toward better ethical choices. The key word here is properly. He believed in something called phronesis, or practical wisdom. This is where experience, reasoning, and emotions all come together to guide our actions. It's like the ultimate ethical toolkit. When we practice this balance long enough, we start to get a feel for what the right decision is, and emotions can actually sharpen our ethical intuition. But here's the kicker: Aristotle didn't think this was some rigid formula. It's not like you can plug in your feelings and logic and get the right answer every time. Life's a bit messier than that, and Aristotle knew it. He thought that as we live and learn, we develop a kind of moral sensitivity, where our emotions, shaped by reason, help us navigate the complexity of life. It's not black and white. It's more like learning to play an instrument. At first, you're clumsy and uncertain, but over time, you start to play with more fluidity and confidence. That's how Aristotle saw ethical decision-making. In today's world, it might seem like emotions get in the way of good decisions, but Aristotle would remind us that they're part of the process. They're signals that, when listened to in the right way, can help us live more virtuous, fulfilling lives. The trick isn't ignoring them, it's learning to work with them, to let them inform our judgment without overwhelming it. That's the kind of balance Aristotle was after, and it's something we could all probably use a little more of in our lives. Number 6. The idea that happiness requires both external goods and internal virtues. Aristotle had this really interesting take on happiness, or eudaimonia, as he called it. It wasn't just some fleeting feeling or momentary pleasure, like how we sometimes think of happiness today. No, for him, it was more like a whole life thing, this deep, lasting sense of fulfillment. But here's where it gets tricky. He didn't think you could get there by just focusing on one thing. Happiness, he believed, required both external goods and internal virtues. Both. That's the balance we've kind of forgotten. Let's break it down. When Aristotle talked about external goods, he meant all those things outside of you that make life a little easier or more enjoyable, things like health, friends, a bit of money, and a stable life. These aren't the core of happiness, but they definitely help. Think of them as the conditions that allow happiness to flourish. If you're constantly struggling to meet basic needs, or if life is just one endless stress factory, it's going to be hard to feel truly fulfilled, no matter how virtuous you are inside. But then there's the other side of the equation, internal virtues. Now, this is where Aristotle got really deep. He believed that true happiness also comes from developing qualities like courage, kindness, wisdom, and self-discipline. These are the traits that shape who you are as a person, and they're entirely under your control. You can't always control external goods. You might lose your wealth, your health might falter, but internal virtues? That's all you. You get to decide how you react to life's ups and downs, how you treat others, how you grow as a person. The key here is balance. Aristotle didn't think you could just rely on external goods or internal virtues alone to achieve lasting happiness. He knew that life is complex, that it throws curveballs, and that both your circumstances and your character matter. You can be the kindest, wisest person in the world, but if you're constantly sick, struggling, or without any support, it's going to be tough to feel fulfilled. On the flip side, you can have all the money, fame, and success you could ever want, but if you lack things like self-awareness, empathy, and courage, that happiness will feel hollow. Aristotle was all about harmony, finding that sweet spot where the external world and your internal world work together. If you can cultivate your virtues, while also navigating the external aspects of life, that's where the real magic happens. It's not about perfection or controlling everything. It's about understanding that happiness is this dynamic, ever-changing thing that you nurture through both your circumstances and your choices. And this idea, that both internal virtues and external goods matter, is something we've kind of drifted away from today. We tend to lean hard in one direction or the other. Sometimes, we focus too much on the material side of things, thinking that once we have enough stuff, happiness will just follow. Other times, we swing too far the other way, believing that happiness is purely about self-development, as if external circumstances don't matter at all. But Aristotle, in his wisdom, knew that happiness is more holistic. It's about cultivating your inner life and creating the right conditions in your external world. It's both the character you build and the way you navigate the world around you. We've forgotten that these two things work together. When we remember that, maybe we can rediscover a deeper, more sustainable kind of happiness. Number 7. The role of habit in character formation. Aristotle had this incredibly sharp insight into human nature. We are what we repeatedly do. It's not just our big decisions that shape us, it's the small, everyday habits that quietly, almost without us noticing, mold our character over time. You know that old saying, practice makes perfect? Aristotle would probably say, not quite. He'd argue that practice doesn't just make perfect, it makes character. It's through our habits that we become who we are, whether we realize it or not. He saw habits as the building blocks of our moral lives. In his view, virtues aren't just things you decide to have one day. You don't wake up and decide, today, I'm going to be courageous, or from now on, I'll be generous. No, it's something deeper, something more consistent. It's in the small choices we make every single day. We become courageous or generous, or whatever other virtue we aim for, through habit, by doing those things over and over until they become part of who we are. What's fascinating about Aristotle's take on habits is that they're like second nature. At first, when we try to build a new habit, it can feel forced or awkward, like we're pushing ourselves to do something that doesn't come naturally. But as we keep doing it, it becomes easier, more automatic. Eventually, it just becomes part of us, like muscle memory. Aristotle would say that's how character is formed, not through big, dramatic gestures, but through the gradual accumulation of small, consistent actions. The flip side of this, of course, is that bad habits work in the same way. Aristotle was acutely aware of how easily we can slip into negative patterns of behavior. Just like practicing good habits leads to virtue, practicing bad habits leads to vice. It's not that people set out to be unkind, cowardly, or dishonest. It's that they start taking small steps in the wrong direction, repeating those actions over time until they become ingrained. Suddenly, without even realizing it, those habits have shaped their character, and they're left wondering how they got there. Aristotle's view of habit also ties into his broader philosophy about balance and moderation. He believed that the key to a good life wasn't just about forming any kind of habit, it was about forming the right habits, and doing so in a balanced way. He thought that developing virtues, the kind that really matter, required us to find the right middle ground between extremes. Courage, for example, is the balance between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity is the middle path between stinginess and wastefulness. The habits we build should reflect this balance, this careful, thoughtful way of living that keeps us grounded. So, Aristotle's big lesson here is that our character is not something we're born with, it's something we create. And the tools we use to create it? Our habits. Every little thing we do, every choice we make, leaves a mark on who we are becoming. And because of that, Aristotle would say it's crucial to pay attention to those small, seemingly insignificant actions. They add up. Over time, they shape not just how we act, but how we think, how we feel, how we relate to the world around us. The best part is that this process is ongoing. Aristotle didn't think character formation was ever finished. We're always in the act of becoming. Every day is a new opportunity to reinforce the habits that bring us closer to the virtues we value. It's not about perfection or getting everything right all the time, it's about consistency, about being mindful of the habits we nurture, knowing that they're shaping us into the person we're going to be tomorrow, next year, or decades from now. Number 8. The idea that justice is a form of complete virtue. Aristotle had this really bold idea about justice that might sound a little different from how we usually think about it. For him, justice wasn't just about laws or fairness in the way we handle things, although, yeah, that's part of it. No, he saw justice as something bigger. To Aristotle, justice was the embodiment of complete virtue, and he meant that in the deepest sense. It's almost like justice wasn't just one thing on a long list of good qualities, it was the sum of all the virtues rolled into one and put into action. Now, let's break this down because it sounds kind of lofty. Aristotle thought that to be just, you had to be virtuous in every aspect of your life. Not just occasionally doing the right thing or making the right call when it's easy. No, real justice for Aristotle was about consistently living out all those virtues, courage, wisdom, temperance, generosity, in your relationships with others. That's where justice gets interesting. It's not just about you. It's about how your actions, guided by your virtues, affect the people around you. For Aristotle, justice was unique because it wasn't just about making yourself a better person. It was about making sure that what you do benefits others. In a sense, when you're being truly just, you're not just thinking about what's best for you but also considering the larger community, the society, the world. This makes justice, in Aristotle's view, the most complete form of virtue. All the other virtues, Courage, honesty, patience, they're important on their own, but they can exist in a bubble if you're only applying them to yourself. Justice, though, bursts that bubble. It pushes those virtues outward, into how you deal with people around you. Now, Aristotle also had this cool way of describing justice in two forms. He talked about distributive justice, which is about making sure people get what they deserve, whether that's rewards, opportunities, or responsibilities, and corrective justice, which is about setting things right when someone's been wronged. And in both cases, Aristotle thought, real justice requires a balanced approach, where you're thinking about fairness but also weighing what's virtuous. It's important to note that Aristotle didn't think of justice as some abstract ideal that's impossible to reach. In his view, it was practical. It was something you could actually practice, like a skill, and get better at. He believed that by developing your character, by growing in virtues like wisdom, patience, and kindness, you naturally become more just. But here's the thing, it's not automatic. You don't become just by thinking about justice. You become just by doing justice, by putting those virtues into action, day after day. One of the really compelling things about Aristotle's take on justice is how he saw it as a kind of balance, a middle ground between extremes. It's not about being overly strict or overly lenient. It's about fairness in the truest sense, recognizing what's deserved, making the right call, and acting with the good of everyone in mind. And it's not just a personal thing. For Aristotle, justice was essential to the health of the whole community. A just person contributes to a just society, and that's the ideal he believed we should be working toward. So when Aristotle called justice a complete virtue, he wasn't just putting it on a pedestal. He was saying that living a life of justice means living a life where all your virtues come together in harmony, not just for your own benefit but for the good of others, too. That's the real power of justice, in his eyes. It's the fullest expression of being virtuous because it affects everyone around you. It's what happens when you take everything you know about being a good person and apply it to the world in a way that makes it better for everyone, not just yourself. In a world that often thinks of justice as a rule book or a system of punishments and rewards, Aristotle's idea of justice as complete virtue feels almost revolutionary. It's about creating harmony, not just following the law. It's about doing right by others, not just because it's expected, but because it's the natural outcome of being a fully virtuous person. In that sense, justice is the pinnacle of what it means to live well, because it's where your personal growth as a virtuous person meets the world and makes it a better place. Number 9. The idea of citizenship and civic responsibility. Aristotle had this pretty radical idea about what it meant to be part of a community. For him, it wasn't just about living alongside other people, minding your own business, and getting on with life. He believed in something much deeper, something he called citizenship, which was tied to this huge concept of civic responsibility. Sounds heavy, right? But at the heart of it, what he was saying is that we don't just exist in isolation. We are social creatures, and we thrive, or fall, together. Now, Aristotle saw citizenship as more than just a legal status or a label. To him, it was about being an active participant in the life of your community. It's not enough to just exist within a society, reaping the benefits without giving anything back. You had to contribute, to engage with others, to be part of the decisions and actions that shape the world you're living in. That's the real kicker. He didn't think you could be truly happy or fulfilled if you weren't engaged in this way. Think about it, Aristotle saw the community as an extension of the individual. So, in his mind, your well-being was intertwined with the well-being of the whole. You couldn't just look out for yourself and ignore everyone else. There's this beautiful reciprocity at play. You give to the community gives back to you, and together, you create something better than any one person could do alone. But here's the part that might surprise us today. Aristotle didn't believe this civic responsibility was just about following rules or paying taxes or voting. Those are surface-level duties. It was about a deeper, more personal investment in the life of the community. He thought you had to care about the common good, not just because you should, but because it's essential to a flourishing life. He really wanted you to feel that connection, to recognize that your actions, or lack of action, ripple out into the wider world. In Aristotle's view, the ideal citizen was someone who wasn't just passive, sitting back and letting others carry the weight. Instead, you were supposed to step up, to engage thoughtfully with what was happening around you. It wasn't about taking charge or seeking power, but about recognizing that your voice, your actions, your involvement mattered. And not just for yourself, for everyone. Here's where it gets really interesting. Aristotle believed that being a good citizen actually helped you become a better person. It wasn't just a duty you performed for the sake of others. Through participating in civic life, through caring about what's happening in your community, you were refining your own character. You were practicing virtues like fairness, justice, and respect. It was a way to grow, to stretch yourself, and to live more fully. What have we forgotten? Maybe it's this sense that we're all in this together, that citizenship is not a solitary thing but a shared experience. Today, we often think of our responsibilities as burdens or obligations, something we have to do. But Aristotle saw them as opportunities, as a way to contribute to something larger than ourselves while also cultivating a richer inner life. So, when Aristotle talked about citizenship and civic responsibility, he wasn't just outlining a set of rules or duties. He was inviting us to see the world, and our place in it, through a different lens. A lens that reminds us we're all connected, and that by being active, engaged participants in our communities, we don't just build a better world. We build better selves. Number 10. Friendship is essential for a good life. Aristotle had this deep understanding of friendship, something that we've sort of lost touch with today. He saw it as way more than just a social add-on or something to pass the time. For him, friendship was essential, vital even, for living a truly good life. Not just the casual "hey, how are you" type of friendships, but real, meaningful connections that shape who we are and help us become better. It was through these bonds, he believed, that we actually find ourselves and live more fully. Let's think about it. We tend to view friendships today as either conveniences or sources of fun. And sure, Aristotle didn't dismiss that side of things. He recognized that some friendships are built on utility, people coming together because it's mutually beneficial. Others are based on pleasure, friends you have a good time with, laugh with, and maybe party with. But Aristotle would say those friendships, while they have their place, aren't enough to sustain a truly rich life. They're temporary, fleeting. Once the benefit fades or the fun dries up, so do those connections. What Aristotle really valued was something deeper, something he called virtuous friendship. This kind of friendship goes beyond convenience or fun. It's about two people who are dedicated to helping each other grow, to become their best selves. It's not just about hanging out, it's about encouraging one another, holding each other accountable, and pushing each other toward greater moral and personal growth. These are the friendships that last because they're based on more than just shared activities, they're built on shared values and a mutual desire for each other's well-being. In Aristotle's view, these virtuous friendships are rare. They take time to develop, and they require effort and commitment. You can't just fall into one overnight. But when you find them, they're irreplaceable. These friendships don't just make life better, they make life whole. He believed that without these kinds of deep connections, something vital is missing. You can have all the success in the world, achieve all your goals, but without true friends, there's a kind of emptiness. Life feels incomplete, like there's this gap that nothing else can quite fill. And it's not just about emotional support either. Aristotle saw friendship as crucial to our character development. Think about it. Who better than a close friend to give us honest feedback, to challenge us when we're not living up to our potential, and to celebrate with us when we do? In a virtuous friendship, there's a shared pursuit of excellence. You're not just coasting through life together, you're both striving, pushing each other to be better. And because of that, these friendships are transformative. They shape who we are and who we become over time. Aristotle also had this idea that friendship is a kind of mirror. In a real, meaningful friendship, you can see yourself reflected back in a way that helps you understand yourself better. You learn more about who you are by being in relation to someone else. Your friend becomes this essential part of your self-knowledge, and in turn, you play the same role for them. It's a mutual process of discovery and growth, and it can't happen in isolation. Friendship, for Aristotle, was the key to unlocking that deeper sense of self and purpose. So, what did Aristotle know that we might have forgotten? That friendship, real friendship, is one of the most important things in life. It's not just about company or comfort, it's about growing, thriving, becoming the best version of yourself, and helping someone else do the same. We might get wrapped up in our busy lives, thinking we can go it alone, but Aristotle reminds us that we can't. Friendship isn't optional if you want to live well. It's essential. Without it, we're missing a huge piece of what it means to truly live. As we've explored today, Aristotle's wisdom on living a meaningful life is timeless. His teachings remind us that true happiness is not found in fleeting pleasures or material success, but in the pursuit of virtue, balance, and purpose. In a world that often pulls us in every direction, it's easy to forget the importance of cultivating good habits, meaningful relationships, and a sense of purpose that goes beyond ourselves. Perhaps now more than ever, we can benefit from slowing down, reflecting on what truly matters, and rediscovering the ancient wisdom that can guide us toward a more fulfilling, intentional life. If you found value in Aristotle's philosophy, consider how you can apply these insights to your daily life. And remember, this journey toward living well isn't a destination, it's a lifelong practice. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep striving for the good life.